Welcome to What is Your Horse's Personality Type video podcast. And I'm really excited to talk about this subject particularly. A few weeks ago, I released a podcast on wild horses, how they're managed, what's their status around the world, why they're important, and why we should care. And I did receive a couple emails that didn't quite see me what I said eye to eye. They were a little bit upset because horses can be seen to be destructive to their environments. And in that podcast, I was discussing how horses might be beneficial. There's some emerging research that large herbivores are actually beneficial to an ecosystem. And the point is, as a scientist, as an educator, we're always very careful not to ruffle feathers because we don't want our science to be questioned. And we like debate in science. That's very important. But our credibility is everything. And so often I'm very careful giving my personal opinions on certain topics. But in this one, I said, maybe shooting horses from helicopters like they're doing in Australia isn't a good thing. And the point I'm bringing this up is because when we talk about horse personalities, and what these emails were saying was I was being too anthropomorphic or applying anthropomorphism, which means giving them human attributes to horses, when I was arguing that maybe we should look at how we manage these wild horses a little closer. And so putting this podcast together got me really thinking about horse personalities and the horses that I've worked with through the years. The one that kept coming up in my mind when I was thinking about really unique horse personalities, and I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of horses. We had very large herds at all the universities I worked with, and then my own personal horses, and they all were unique. They all had different characteristics. Now there's some generalities, yes, and we're going to talk about that today, especially when it comes to certain breeds. But when it came to individual horses that I formed, tight bonds with, they were my companions. Brosco, one of the first horses I ever rid, came straight to my mind. This was a quarter horse Appaloosa cross. He was a dapple gray. He was stubborn. He was cheeky. He cracked me up with his behaviors. And, I remember whenever I would tack him up, he would pull his saddle pad off and look at me, his ears pricked forward, like, what are you going to do? And it was a game to him. I remember in California trail riding up hills. And I remember one day specifically in my mind, I've never forgotten this. We were bareback riding and he stopped uphill so I'd slide right off, because I was a big kid, as big as I was now, or big as I am now, and I would just slide right off, and then he'd look at me like, you're an idiot. And I'd laugh and I'd get frustrated because I was trying to turn him and he wouldn't turn, and I just slid right off, and he did it like 4 or 5 times, and finally I just had to walk him up the hill. It was hilarious for him, I guess, not for me at the time, but it just showed that he was an individual. And when we talk about horse personalities, or we talk about these horses today in the 21st century, we realize these are not biological robots. These are not animals that don't have feelings, don't have personalities, that just react, or instinct is what, humans traditionally have always thought of animals. And the thing is, we don't realize is we're animals. We are an animal. We are just currently the most intelligent animal on the planet. And we are dominating the space, obviously. But there are different levels of cognition that I'm going to get into. So the point being, when we talk about these things, we have to realize that horses are sentient beings. And again, I'll explain that a little bit more here in a second too, especially with the laws changing and welfare and how we think about them. These are not, animals to be abused. These are animals to be respected and loved and cared for. And when we look at our planet and all the animals we share with, we have to look at it through that lens. Now, what that means, there's so many different debates, and this isn't, again, I'm careful not to ruffle feathers, but this isn't an animal rights thing. This is an animal welfare thing, and respect for them. And so, that leads me into personalities. And this was a special request from one of the listeners, Madeline, that emailed me. And I thought it was something that I definitely wanted to tackle. And the question is, do horses have personalities? What does the science say? It says yes. The short answer is yes, absolutely. And we're going to talk about some of the different studies that have been done and talk about some of the different personality surveys out there that are available to you that you can apply to your own horse. And it gives you more insight to them and how we manage them and again, their welfare. So this idea of anthropomorphism, which the Oxford Dictionary describes as, quote, the attribution of human characteristics or behavior to an animal. And, are horses on our level of cognition? No, obviously not. But is there a scale? Yes. And we're actually finding out certain birds are, so you're going to find out here in a second. I've got a list of some of the smartest animals on the planet that are very intelligent, that understand how to use tools. Tools use is a big thing. So certain birds use tools. I mean, octopus in the ocean, you would think instinctual, but they're actually, they think, which is crazy. So there's a lot that's changing in these last few decades on how we view animals and animal cognition. And I think some of the most incredible research coming out from these scientists, animal behaviorists from around the world, is something like culture. Animals have culture. So again, the point of this is to expand your mind. So when we talk about personalities, you can go, yeah, okay, I can see where that's valid. But when you think of culture, we never think of animals. But my best example of culture are orcas. And they have characteristics of what we consider culture. They have different dialects between pods. And we know there's different pods around the world. Some hunt fish, some hunt seals, some hunt whales. And one of the things is they notice with culture is the grandmothers are teaching the young calves how to hunt. So wave washing, if you've seen it on some of these nature channels, they will teach the young orcas to swim with them to create a wave and wash seals off icebergs into the water so they can get a meal, or beach themselves off South America to catch seals on land. And that's the grandmothers teaching them. So that's indications of culture. So again, the point is we are understanding animals so much greater today, and that applies to our horses. We understand so much more about them, how much more intelligent they are than we give them credit for, or many people give them credit for. So animal cognition, there is, so what is cognition? It's a broad range of mental abilities, including memory. So let's think cognition, memory. Do horses have memory? Absolutely. How do they remember your cues? Of course they do. Picking up their feet. I mean, everything we do in training is teaching them, and then they have memory recall, right? And then even later, after they haven't been messed with, I mean, yeah, they do get back to that feral wild state, but they come back quickly. They have memory. Problem solving. Can horses problem solve? Yes, there's studies ongoing looking at the level. And I've talked about some of that in some of these other podcasts, talking about horses being able to indicate with if they want a blanket or not. Learning. So again, cognition, learning. Yeah, of course. I just talked about that, of course. Environmental adaptation. Can horses adapt to their environment? So yeah, I mean, out in the wild, they're problem solving. They're adapting all the time. So we know there's different levels of cognition. And when we look at some of the top species, I mean, obviously we are the top of tool use, language, our abstract thinking. I mean, we've got probes out in our solar system. I think our farthest probe is actually outside our solar system now. I mean, we're, we are very intelligent, obviously. Then chimpanzees. So they have very advanced social structure, social skills, advanced problem solving. Then dolphins. So they have complex social systems. Elephants, talked about that before in a podcast where elephants have mourning. They've noticed elephants will go out of their way, you know, I don't know, hundreds, but, you know, dozens of kilometers to go by and look at the bones of an old matriarch. And then they'll mourn. They'll sit there for like hours, pick up the bones, taste the bones, and sit there and they're like in mourning. Then cephalopods, gray parrots, like I talked about, crows and ravens, gorillas, they're up there. Bonobos, which are like chimpanzees, dogs are up there, and rats. Rats are very intelligent. And then horses. They show recognition, memory, and sensory processing capabilities. You know, and then you go and there's a whole list and range. And then I talked about in a previous podcast, horses can learn to use symbols to communicate their preferences. This was published less than 10 years ago in Applied Animal Behavior Science. And this was research out of Norway where those horses were able to indicate if they wanted to blanket or not, you know, based on the weather. And they correctly did that. I know some of my own research and behavioral research training young foals. And this was with Dr. Angie Adkin. Part of her master's research going into her PhD research was how quickly could foals learn it? Foals at 3 weeks of age were clicker trained and they were coming over for scratches. And, you know, so they showed a level of learning and cognition at that early of an age. So horses are complex. They do have emotion. They do have tight social bonds. They have memory. They can experience trauma and they remember trauma. Talked about this in a previous podcast. I've had horses that don't want anything to do with me because of a man. Anytime they're around men, they were very nervous and anxious. But women, they were okay with. And that's probably based on a traumatic experience with a man, a trainer. And some of you are going, oh, yeah, okay, yeah. You know, horses experience trauma. So to go back to the beginning of this, when we talk about anthropomorphic, you know, that definition is applying, you know, fewer and fewer. Is a horse going to build a rocket ship? No, not today. But they still have a level of sentience that we have to recognize, and that leads into personalities. Now, really quickly, animal sentience, I talked about this in welfare. 32 countries in the world right now, you know, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, parts of the United States, Denmark, France, Greece, Italy, Ireland, Spain, many others, they all recognize that animals are sentient, which means they have the capacity to experience positive and negative feelings, such as pleasure, joy, pain, and distress that matter to the individual. Okay, so yes, they're complex. And yes, they have personalities. Anybody that's been around them knows horses have different personalities. Now, that leads me into what is a personality. Like when we say, okay, they have a personality, what does that mean? I mean, we have an idea, but let's define that. So, to quote, personality refers to the unique and relatively consistent patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that characterizes an individual. So it also encompasses a wide range of intrinsic and extrinsic traits, behaviors, and emotional patterns that evolve from biological and environmental factors. So this is a whole different podcast for a different day, but we talk about nature versus nurture. And this is something in science, in behavioral science, we talk a lot about. In my career, I've talked a lot about it and looking at studies doing that. Nature is your genetics, your breed. We're going to talk about breeds here in a second. Your species, you know, how a horse, and are there certain behavioral traits like quick to anger or calm demeanor? Those are genetic. And we know nature plays a role. I'm going to talk about hot-blooded and cold-blooded horses, the differences there. We know those are nature, those are genetic traits. Then environmental factors is nurture. Do they have a good mom or not? Like I just said, there was horses I've worked with, it was like 2 or 3 that I couldn't work with because I was a man. They just were frightened of men and I didn't want to push them. And my grad students, they took care of the horse. And that is a nurture thing. That means that horse was abused at some point or went through some trauma with a man, but it shows you the nurture. So key elements of personality include consistency. So that's important. So it's something that every day. And when I look at my personality, I always feel like I'm an easygoing empath. I love animals, obviously. I love horses. I love teaching. That is just who I am. It's consistent day in, day out. When I wake up in the morning with my children, with my animals, doing my job or doing this podcast, it's just, I love it. I'm enthusiastic. I'm empath. That's who I am. That's my nature or nurture. I'm probably grew that way too. That is who I am. That's my personality. Psychological and physiological. So personality is a psychological construct, but influenced by biological processes and needs. So again, that's tying in nature and nurture, right? So that shapes our personality, our genetics and then our upbringing. Impact behaviors and action. So how we react to situations. Like I said, I'm an empath. Yeah, I'm a big guy. I mean, I'm 6'5" or 197 centimeters tall. But I'm like the gentle giant. I guess that's why I love draft horses so much. I resonate with them. So when I react to stressful situations, I'm calm. I tend to think a lot about it. Maybe I overthink situations sometimes. I'm very cerebral. I don't react where, somebody close to me, my family or something, is reactive. They get angry or they are, don't do well in certain situations. Then multiple expressions. So it's not, again, these aren't robots. They're not biological robots. They have thoughts. Horses think, obviously. They have feelings. They're depressed or they're excited. We see it every day in the barn or in training. They have close relationships. We know horses are very gregarious. They form close relationships and other social interactions. So we're going to break this down a little bit more and what the research in the last 20 years has shown with horse personalities. Now, let's take it back to that nature, those genetics, those breed traits. And there's a good article on madbarn.com, hot-blooded versus cold-blooded versus warm-blooded horse breeds. You can read through there. It has some good breed characteristics, but I'm going to summarize them here in a second. Now, when we say a horse is hot-blooded, cold-blooded, or warm-blooded, again, that doesn't reference their body temperature. Every horse on the planet, when they're healthy, their body temperature ranges from 99 to 101 degrees Fahrenheit, or that's 37.5 to 38.5 degrees Celsius. So it doesn't reference their blood temperatures, it references their temperament. Now, when we go through this and look, our hot-blooded horses, these are our athletic, fast, agile, they've got spirited temperament. They're more sensitive to cues or stimuli. They are known for their endurance. They're high energy. They're refined physical characteristics, really beautiful horses. And you see them in a lot of sports, a lot of different sports, Western disciplines, English disciplines, but show jumping, dressage, you see a lot of these horses. And when you think of it, think of our thoroughbreds. That's who probably you were thinking of. Our Arabs, our barb horses, our Teki horses. So these are the bloodlines that went on to form many other breeds. But when you look at thoroughbreds, the Arabs, the Turks, Turk horses, those are those bloodlines that had been established or bred into them. So they carried a lot of these hot temperaments. And I've worked with thoroughbreds at the racetrack. I've worked with Arabs. I remember the one thoroughbred, I told this story a while back. Secretariat's daughter, I can't remember her name. I'll have to go back and look. I really have got to research this one. She was a young, going into her 3-year-old year, and she was a turd to handle. She was spirited. She was, I was hot walking her quite a lot, and she was just a lot to handle. And I remember that. And I remember that, as the thoroughbreds on the track, they were all, again, they were on very high energetic diets too, because they were racing thoroughbreds. But then I thought of the Arabs I've worked with. And I remember in the breeding shed, I had a couple Arabs on a project. And anytime I was doing ultrasounds or anytime of reproductive manipulation, I was just very cautious, because they would display behaviors that they weren't quite happy. They didn't like to be in stocks for very long. They're just very spirited animals. And so anytime you're working around a hot-blooded horse, they display those personality types. Now, that's one end of the spectrum. Let's go to the other end. Our cold-blooded, our draft horses. These are the calm temperaments, strong, large, right? The gentle giants. And it was probably very important when they were developing these breeds centuries ago that they did have these calm temperaments, because that size, that much strength, they could cause havoc on us physically, but also just think of fences and barns and where they kept these horses. They were so big and so strong that if they were a little bit wild or hot tempered, doesn't mean, and again, a caveat to all of this, doesn't mean with the hot blooded breeds, there aren't ones that are totally calm and bomb proof, things like that. Cold blooded horses, you're going to get that obscure one that is hot tempered. But in general, the breeds, these were very calm horses because they were pulling heavy loads, pulling carriages. They had to be patient, stoic. And the ones I've handled, the few times I've handled them, Belgians, Percherons, Clydesdales, and they just wonderful horses. So like I said, Shire horses, Friesians, I've handled Friesians too. The ones I handled, they were a little spirited, but still calm demeanor. Very, very awesome horses. Love them. Love my cold-blooded horses. And then we get the mix. So you're mixing your bloodlines to these warm-blooded horses, these long-established breeds, some of them. But think of your Dutch warm bloods, your Hanoverians, Tricaners, Holsteiners, Oldenburgs, so many more. American Quarter Horse would fit into this. Worked with hundreds of them. Now the appendix quarter horses, these have some thoroughbred blood in them. They can be a little bit spirited. So the ones you see coming off the racetrack at quarter horse racing, because again, they have might be a little bit more hot blooded, but in general, quarter horses, your Western disciplined horses, gosh, they're just incredible, wonderful animals. And that's why they're one of the more popular breeds in the world. And they're popping up all over the place because they're just awesome riding horses. But some of these others, I mean, our top competitor, Dutch warm bloods, KWPN, when you go look at the lists, the top money earners in dressage and show jumping, eventing, a lot of these are warm bloods. And so their temperaments, personalities are kind of a mix. So not quite, I wouldn't say bomb proof, but calm and steady, like you can just predict with a draft horse, and not as flighty or as high strung as, say, an Arab or a thoroughbred. They're in between. They just have those moments. Now, when we look at breeds specifically in personalities, one of the things, yes, we know breed characteristics are going to be more reactive or less reactive, like I just talked about. So here's one study I pulled just to back it by science, but this was the effects of breed management and personality on cortisol reactivity in sport horses. This was published about 5 years ago in PLOS One, coming out of Europe. So They were looking at thoroughbreds and warm bloods, and then this is a new breed for me. I mean, I've come across it, but I didn't know a lot about it. But the Freiburger or Franchise Montagnes, I just butchered that. But the Freiburger horse, that's the English version. It's a Swiss breed, and it's a light draught type horse. So remember, there's like 500-600 breeds of horses around the planet. And when they looked at cortisol, which is when you're stressed, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis kicks out cortisol. And we feel that anxiety, and what cortisol does is it gets your heart rate going, dilates vessels, directs energy to your muscles, fight or flight. It's a fight or flight hormone. And in this study, just really quickly to get to the end of it, thoroughbreds and warm bloods displayed an increased adrenal response in comparison to the Freiburger horse. So basically, they're just saying the draft horses are just more calmer than, say, a thoroughbred and even warm bloods. So when we look at hot-blooded, cold-blooded, there's a paper that supports that. Now, when we look at breed personalities, so this was a very good study out of the UK, and it was published a little bit over 10 years ago, but still valid. Horse personality variation between breeds. This was published in Applied Animal Behavioral Sciences, excellent journal. And they were looking at different characteristics of personalities and then tied it back to breed. Now, they used the Horse Personality Questionnaire, HPQ, and it was a 25-item rating method. And it's one of these out there that's pretty reliable. Now, I'll just put it out here. You can go online, and there's a million on there. I'm going to talk about eBark at the end. That's one that's backed by science. There are some out there that you can use, and for fun, to get an idea that might be based on some of this. But these are the ones that are based in science. So these are the ones I'm going to be bringing up today. And so the Horse Personality Questionnaire is one that studies have been done that validate it as showing personalities. And I thought it'd be fun to kind of go through the different types this one does talk about. And then you can kind of check off in your mind for your own horses and go, okay, yeah, my horse might fit here. And again, you'd have to go through the whole 25 rating system to get an idea of their personality type. But, overall, you can probably get an idea. So this has 6 different equine personality dimensions. Now, their personalities are probably not going to be as complex as ours. There hasn't been tons and tons and tons of personality research in horses, say, versus humans. So, just understand some of this is just basic personality testing, but I think it does apply to your horses. So the 6 categories are dominance, anxiousness, excitability, protection, sociability, and inquisitiveness. Okay, so your horse, and the human personality test that I've done, and I've done some in research too, actually, with my teaching, we tend to fall into predominantly one category, and then we have characteristics in others, right? So if you have a horse that's anxious in excitability, they could be predominantly anxious and then a little bit excitability, or both, or they could be 50-50. So there are some descriptors that I'm going to read through, and as I read through them, just think, okay, is this my horse or not? So I'm going to go bounce back and forth these two and look at it. If some of those fit into your horse, this is the type of personality that the Horse Personality Questionnaire would put your horse in. So dominance, meaning are they reliable? Are they subordinate? Are they equable, meaning not tense or nervous? It's a calm, even-tempered horse. Eccentric, effective, stubborn, aggressive, or irritable. So there's 2 ways of looking at dominance. Animals that can be dominated or animals that are dominant. Anxiousness. So it's a horse that's suspicious, insecure, tense, apprehensive, or fearful. Okay, excitability. So anxiousness, that's more of a personality than excitable. Take away the fearfulness things. Excitable is active, or are they slow? The excitable, intelligent. Protection. So this is an understanding, motherly, protective horse. Sociable or sociability. So are they sociable, playful, or popular? And then inquisitiveness. Are they curious or opportunistic? So again, they looked at these, doing this questionnaire in this study, and applied it to 1,223 different horses from 8 different horse breeds. And then did a comparison to see if there was breed characteristics that fell into this. So for their cold-blooded breeds, they looked at Irish drought horses, Shetland ponies, Highland ponies. Hot breeds were thoroughbreds and Arabs. And then warm breeds were a Welsh quarter horse and Appaloosa. The Welsh ponies, they were saying it does have a mix of Arab and thoroughbred blood in them, so that makes it more of a warm-blooded pony. Most ponies are considered cold-blooded, meaning they're pretty calm and easily to handle, but Welsh ponies may fall into that, and some of you that own them go, yeah, I can see that. So the study did find breed differences, and then when we look at it in all those categories we talked about, so dominance, the most dominant that scored the highest was the Irish drought horse. Scored the lowest was the thoroughbred. And then the other cold-blooded tend to look in there. And at the end, I'll talk about their generalities. Anxiousness. So which horses would you think if I said anxious? Well, probably automatically thinking hot-blooded. You're correct. So thoroughbred scored the highest. Arabs and then those Welsh ponies scored the next. Excitability. So you're probably thinking hot-blooded again. You'd be correct. So the thoroughbred scored the highest. Arabs was the next highest. The lowest was the Irish drought horse, right next to the Highland ponies and the Appaloosas. So those cold-blooded Appaloosas are pretty calm that I've worked with, the few. Protection. So which horse would you think would be the most protective? That's a good question, right? It's the Irish drought horse. That scored the highest. Shetland ponies were next, and the Highland ponies. So Arabs scored really high too, actually. So Arabs scored the highest, 6.31. Sorry, I looked at the statistic. Arabs scored the highest of protection. So very loyal horse. There you go. Sociability. So which ones are you thinking are the most social? The cold or hot? It's more the hot ones. So your thoroughbreds, your Arabs scored the highest there. Welsh ponies were up there a little bit too. And then inquisitiveness. Which one is the most inquisitive? It actually is a thoroughbred. Scored really high, 9.2, and the Arabs with 9.4. So both of them were really, really high on that. So in summary, what they were looking at, to quote them, the highest level of variability was found in excitability. So when we looked at excitability scores, they were all over the place. Thoroughbreds were up there higher with the Arabs. Welsh ponies were kind of in the mix. And then even quarter horses were higher than Appaloosas, right next to Shetland ponies. So Shetland ponies were a little bit more excitability than a quarter horse. Shetland pony, cold blood. Quarter horse is a warm blood. Dominance and protection had the lowest variability, so not a lot of differences there. Sociability and inquisitiveness was in the middle. And the thoroughbred had high scores on dominance, anxiousness, excitability, sociability, and inquisitiveness, but had low scores on protection, where the Irish drought horse had low scores on all of those with a high score on protection. So to take all that home and to kind of explain it, there are breed differences. So again, that nature, the genetics of the breed shows that there are differences there that will lead into different personalities. Now, each horse has an individual personality because then you have that nurture, its environment. How is raised its mom? One of the greatest questions is, if we cloned Secretariat, could he, the clone, be as good as the original? You know, would he go out and his record still stands on some racetracks? So could he still go out and compete at that level as a clone? And that's a question in science, because nature genetically should be very similar, but nurture, different mother, different upbringing, different trainers, different riders, even the racetracks are different than they were 50 years ago. So keep that in mind too. So that, again, nature and nurture, they both play together to develop these personalities. So when we go back to anthropomorphic, this study addressed it. And again, like I said, science debate is good. We like to debate, but we bring up arguments. And so the authors said in this paper, quote, "The use of terms such as those used in the horse personality questionnaire have been criticized by some as being anthropomorphic. But they counter it with support from other scientists and other papers that said, however, other scientists argue against this concern. In their review of the animal personality literature," and they quote this paper, "it was demonstrated that independent observers were able to agree about the personality ratings of individuals. Furthermore, it has been noted that the use of anthropomorphic terms is more practical, especially, for example, when all one may need to know is whether an animal is agreeable or not." So when we say a horse is anxious, some scientists say you can't say a horse experiences anxiety like humans do. Because again, we're not and this is, again, where the debate is, right? I could argue with them. Yeah, I can tell if a horse is anxious. They exhibit those behaviors. How else could you describe it? But then they say, well, it's not anxiety. Horses don't experience anxiety because they're simple thinkers or whatever. And they come up with their counter arguments. And that's what we do in science. We go to these conferences, we have these discussions, we have them over lunches, we have them over dinners. They can be exhausting. Those conferences are always exhausting because we're always engaging our brains, and we're always our learned opinion, because we read the studies, we read the literature, we understand what other people are saying, and then we come up with a consensus, right? So the consensus is getting that horses are a lot more intelligent than we give them credit for. That consensus is true today. And so they said, hey, we use these terms and they are acceptable in doing these studies. All right, switching gears a little bit, there's another equine personality questionnaire that quite a bit of research has been done in recent years. This study out of England was looking at investigating the validity of an equine personality questionnaire, again, applied to animal behavioral science. This was published in 2022. So they're looking at the validity of it, meaning if we take this equine personality test, EPT, can we validate it? Meaning, if I give it to you and then me, and we're independent observers, and we go out and we answer this looking at the horse, and our answers are pretty similar, and then we do it with 10 other people, that's validating these behavioral tests, right? And I've done some research in this field too, where we've gone out and had to validate surveys, validate different ethograms, studying behavior, and then we had to train people how to use it correctly. Then once they went through a test and we gave them the check, then we went out and did our studies. Now, this one specifically, the equine personality test, was developed specifically for horses in the last 10 years. And it's a factor-based model of equine personality. And there's different factors. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. In this paper, they talk about horse personalities and the different types. So they're recognizing horses do have different personalities. So when you look at the equine personality test, they're looking at ranges of a personality type, I guess. And on a sliding scale of like 1 to 5, where would that horse fall in? And then there's certain characteristics that will fit into agreeableness, neuroticism, and extroversion And then this personality test has some questions to see if the horse is gregarious with people or gregarious with other horses. So you can see where your horse might fall in, and I'll go through these, and you can rate them 1 to 5, or the sliding scale where they fit. So for example, is it spirited or steady? Now, your horse could be somewhat spirited, could be very spirited. It could be in the middle, or it could be somewhat steady or very steady. So it's a Likert sliding scale, and you would figure out where your horse fits in there. So in this, they go easygoing versus intolerant, and that is related to agreeableness. So is your horse easygoing or intolerant? So again, you go very easygoing, somewhat easygoing, in the middle, or somewhat intolerant or very intolerant. Okay. So if they were very easygoing, that would score high in agreeableness. If they were very intolerant, that would score low. So I hope that makes sense. Then you have argumentative to well-mannered. So again, these are all for agreeableness. Then you have obedient or wayward. Then you have willing or stubborn, gentle or rough, and those are all for agreeableness. Now, when we switch to neuroticism, is the horse anxious or is it confident? So if it's very anxious, that would be more neuroticism. If it's more confident, it's less, right? Then you go down to, is it nervous or calm, relaxed or tense, quiet or restless? Okay. So you can see how this fits for more. I mean, every time I say quiet or restless, I have all these different horses in my mind. Oh yeah, she was quiet. Oh, he was, especially stallions, very restless. So maybe more neurotic. Then your extroversion. So here you have placid or active. So again, very quiet horse in the corner, or very active up and down the pasture or in their paddocks or whatever. Then you had adventurous or habitual, excitable, laid back, spirited or steady. Okay, so that will give you the 3 big ones. Then when you looked at gregariousness, it was asking you some questions. When it has the opportunity, how often does this horse initiate interaction with you? It would be never, and then the middle would be sometimes or always, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you rate them there. When it has the opportunity, how often does this horse initiate interaction with other people? So if they scored always a 5, that's high. They're scoring high in gregarious with people, right? When it has the opportunity, how often does the horse initiate interaction with other horses? Okay, so that's interaction. That's gregariousness with horses. 1 to 5, never, sometimes, always. Does this horse ever show affection towards other horses? Again, 1 to 5. That's the gregariousness with them. Then the final question in this questionnaire is, in general, how fearful is this horse around other horses? So that correlates with neuroticism. And then the extroversion, generally, how energetic would you say this horse is? And then for the final one, generally, how dependable, how would you say this horse is? Okay. Now, all of this was developed by Dr. Emma Creighton at Newcastle University. So I wanted to say that in there. Now, when this study looked at the ability of different observers to agree with some of these, scored very high, except how fearful is this horse around other horses was tough. They had difficulty evaluating that. And it probably was the study design. They were looking at them at competitions and doing different tests. So that one would be maybe a little bit harder to evaluate. So when they're trying to validate this survey, they're like, well, maybe, we need to look at other things to see how gregarious this horse is towards other horses. But that is a big one that when you look at the literature, there's been a lot of research on it, validating that equine personality test. And again, you can back up this video and go back and then look at those images, and you can just score your horse yourself and then see where they fit in. Now, there's another personality test that you can do online, and this is out of Australia. And I just saw a bunch of these researchers a few weeks ago at the ISES conference here in New Zealand. But eBark, you can go to e-barq.com, and there is a how-to video on that site, and you can fill out an eBark personality survey that they're using to gather data, right? They're looking at a lot of welfare issues and overall horse personalities, and their categories are trainability, rideability, boldness, handling compliance, working compliance, easy to stop, forward going, human social confidence, non-human social confidence, novel object confidence, touch sensitivity, easy to load, and independence. So that survey will go in there, and then they actually will give you results on where your horse falls in versus others. The final point I want to make of this is why care about personalities? It's not just interesting to us, but it does apply to how we manage them. We know if I'm dealing with an Arab or a thoroughbred, I'm a little bit more on guard. I'm a little bit more, watching their behavior a little bit closer, and I'm a little bit more cautious on how I approach them as far as training, tacking up, putting saddles on them. I mean, and all of this stuff that we do to horses. If I know they're a hot-blooded horse, I'm a little bit, yeah. And then our cold-blooded or warm bloods, quarter horse, I'm always on guard around horses. This is something you should always be on guard. You should never, let your guard down around them. But I know I can assume this horse is going to be a little bit easier to handle. All the cold-blooded, it's handfuls, like less than a dozen that I've dealt with in my life. They've all been easy to halter, easy to walk, easy to manipulate and ultrasound and do all the things that I did with them. But when we know more about their personalities, it's not just our own safety, it's theirs, how we manage them, their welfare. Because this study was wow. I was like, wow, when I read it. Again, out of the UK, Applied Animal Behavior Science, excellent journal. This was published 10 years ago. Pain expression is linked to personality in horses. And it really got me thinking, and it was like, wow, okay, understanding your horse's personality and some of these traits can impact their longevity, their lifespan. So they talk about, again, the importance of personalities in the beginning, leading to some behavioral syndromes and welfare, considerations, especially when it comes to pain. And just to put in this, Department of Animal Science at UC Davis has the Animal Behavior and Cognition Lab talking about affective states of horses, affective states of animals. So major universities in the world, especially UC Davis, one of the top programs in the world, one of the best vet schools in the world, is looking at animal behavior and cognition. Okay, so to give some more credibility to what we're talking about today. Now, lameness, looking at pain in horses. In this paper, they say, quote, lameness is a behavioral indicator used by researchers, veterinarians, and caregivers to gauge the severity of painful conditions affecting the locomotive system. So the American Association of Equine Practitioners has a 5-point lameness scoring system. 0, no lameness. 1, lameness difficult to observe, not consistent, whether they're riding or however you're moving the horse. 2, 3, 4 is lameness is obvious at a walk. So this is the sliding scale, right? And then 5, lameness produces minimal weight bearing in motion and or at rest or complete inability to move. So you go 1, barely can detect the lameness, to 5, wow, the horse isn't really moving. But now let's tie it to personality. And it got me really thinking of horses that are neurotic, as we talked about in that equine personality test, extrovert. So these neurotic, negative emotions, anxiety, worry, fear, anger, frustration. Extrovert, outgoing, active. Then they had stoic, which is endurance of pain or hardship without display of feeling. and then tolerance. So when they looked at those 4 personalities and then looked at the pain scale, so they gave the horse a personality score, then they looked at their lameness score, and then they looked at the severity of the lameness. And it was really, wow, eye-opening for me. And I said, yeah, it makes sense. They said, because the worry here is, to quote them, quote, pain behavior caused both over and underestimation of severity. Overestimation or false positive is likely to result in excessive pain relief with side effects. Okay, giving them too much pain meds. Unnecessary invasive treatment and euthanasia. So if a horse's personality is to be neurotic, meaning they can't endure pain very well, they have any little bit of pain and they're like acting crazy, versus the stoic or tolerant horse that is underestimating or false negatives will result in unmitigating pain, causing suffering, distress, and detriment to health. And then, so when you think about neurotic or stoic, so the 2 different personality types, and then you tie it into pain, well, wow, okay, it makes sense. Because a horse that's stoic, in my mind, I'm thinking, because a lot of horses they hide pain very well. We know that from the wild. They don't want to get picked off. Even in this paper, they talk about it. So they try to hide pain and lameness, because if they do, a predator will see it and chase them down. Versus the neurotic horse, but if the neurotic horse shows pain earlier, they'll get treatment earlier and maybe have better pain management. And so that's what they talked about. Highly neurotic horses were found to be less stoic, as calculated from clinical data. This suggests that behavioral indicators of pain are induced at a lower threshold of severity in highly neurotic animals. So they were also rated less tolerant to pain by their owners. So if you have a horse, you identify their personality type, you're like, yeah, they're neurotic, and they show some pain, that's good. That means they're going to get treatment earlier. Whereas if we go to the other side, where they're less tolerant, so thinking of our cold bloods or, oh gosh, I have so many bomb-proof horses that they would hide it. So if they're more tolerant to pain, they're more stoic, that could decrease their careers. They could develop osteoarthritis or some of these other problems earlier before we can detect it and know it. So if you know your horse is that way, then you can do things like, getting pain assessments and having your vets look at them and, feeling limbs for warmth and all that stuff. So that's why I think it's important. And, it's understanding your horse personality is understanding them. It's going to provide you with tools and understanding to provide better management for your horses, better welfare for our horses. And it tells their story. Again, these are not biological robots. And sure, I'll take the emails. I will stand and die on that hill. These are sentient creatures that deserve our love, deserve our respect. They need to be cared for properly, but more importantly, they need to be respected. And I think that's the takeaway from this, is understanding their personalities and then just overall respecting the horse. So that's it for this video podcast. Again, if you're enjoying this content, send me an email, podcast@madbarn.com. You can read under the video. There's a description of this with timestamps, but there's also all of our social media channels. The email's there. Email me. And I don't mind, listening to different opinions. Again, as a scientist, as an educator, I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly evolving. How I understand horses has changed so much in my career. Where 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when I was a little younger, my understanding of horses and how we feed them, how we care for them, their welfare, that has all drastically changed in the last 2-3 decades of my life. So, understand their personalities. But yeah, hit that subscribe button, start the conversation, and share this content. Share it with your friends. What do they think? Do you know your horse's personality type? What do you think? So anyways, thanks for listening. Take care.